they're all quacks and witch doctors. That's what my dad said when we wanted to go to counseling. Unfortunately, many people have a negative stigma about going to see professional counselors or therapists. And there's been a long stigma partly because the professions did grow out of some pseudoscience and spiritualistic practices. So it's probably a long time ago at least we had to differentiate between the practices in the past. There's been, phrenology, mesmerism, there's been woo-woo, and unfortunately a lot of times people associate mental health professions with those kinds of things, even though psychology is a scientific practice. And in the last couple hundred years, psychology developed as a scientific discipline and really tried to incorporate or be based on science. And unfortunately, because of that, sometimes Christians and other religious people see psychology as anti-religious, even though it's trying to be based on science. And so because of that, then you have the stigma about it being secular or anti-religious. So you have stigmas from both ends. People who think there's too much woo-woo, or the people who think it's anti-religious. And so how do we overcome these things? And then you have people who have stigma about seeking help. And thankfully, over time, we've shed some of these stigmas. But it's important to understand why, and also to understand some of the things that psychology is not. And so we're going to take a look at some pseudosciences and also some spiritualistic practices in this lesson. Now, this chapter is called Quackery, but I also want to be sensitive to people who actually believe these things. We're going to take a look at some beliefs and practices. There's been a long history throughout time since the beginning of time, of people who believe the stars or the moon contribute to the way people are. In fact, in ancient times, we're going to look at how astrology had played a role. So the point here I just want to say is that the whole point of this lesson is that we have stigmas that psychology is either too religious or too much or too woo-woo or too scientific. And hopefully we want people to know that they can reach out and seek help, and that it's okay. It's okay to seek help, and that they're going to get the help. And it works, and it's all based on science. The main point of what we'd like to talk about today is that we need to be careful about falling into the common tendency to assume that behavior is a result of only spiritual or mental processes without considering the role that biology plays. This has led to judging people's abnormal behavior or as a result of moral failures rather than understanding their struggles. However, considering the role of biology requires the help of progress in medical science, as a poor understanding of biology has also caused harm as well. So in this lesson, you will identify fake science or pseudoscience in psychology. You'll describe the problem with the dualistic division of the mind and body, and identify ways that pseudoscience is still common in self-help and relationship advice today. The first area that we're going to look at in pseudosciences is spiritual and metaphysical explanations. Throughout history, philosophers and physicians have attempted to explain how the mind controls the body's behaviors. Deviations from normal behavior were attributed to spiritual causes since the beginning of time. This would lead to interesting methods of attempting to cure mental illnesses. As early as 3000 BC, people in ancient times drilled holes into the skull of an ill person's head to relieve pressure or to let out spirits. This has been called trepanning or trepanation or trephining. However it's spelled, it's often spelled differently depending on the translation. In the picture you can see Incan skulls where people drilled into the skull to relieve pressure or to let out spirits. And this practice continued into the Middle Ages as well. And here's a painting, a satirical painting from about 1488 to 1516 called Extracting the Stone of Madness. So you can see someone also drilling into someone's head there. Another practice has been common is the practice of bloodletting. This was a practice of cutting and purposefully letting someone bleed. This is believed to have benefits for the mind if there is pressure in the head or some kind of imbalance. Now abandoned, it was the most common medical practice performed by surgeons from antiquity until the late 19th century, a span of almost 2,000 years. So you can see here a picture of ancient times, ancient Near East, to modern, or about the 1800s, modern times. Another thing that we might consider a spiritualistic explanation of behavior would be, or pseudoscientific, whatever you might want to call it, is astrology. Astrology is a belief system that says the position of the sun, moon, and stars and the timing of the month or season people were born in influences their behavior. This practice goes back thousands of years and is seen in cultures around the world. Now, scientists have often been interested in confirming or disconfirming this, and a study in 1985 involving a double-blind test confirmed that predictions based on astrology are really no better than chance. It's interesting because today we know that people who are born during winter months when the moon is seen longer in the sky are more likely to suffer from mental disorders, but it's not due to the stars or the presence of the moon. Rather, it's probably more likely due to the lack of sunlight and vitamin D. The ancient Greek physician Hippocrates, the father of medicine, tried to come up with a more biological explanation for why people did what they did, rather than relying on the stars. Now, he believed that behavior was controlled by four humors, and probably based on some observations of the body or anatomy, he described four humors as blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm or water. And we will see these again when we talk about personality temperaments. He believed that an imbalance of these would cause mental illnesses or something like that. Now, ancient Greek philosophers after Hippocrates laid the groundwork for modern Western sciences, but they still held to a more spiritualistic understanding of the mind. For example, Plato, who lived about 420s to about 348 or 347 BC, believed that the mind pre-existed as a soul that came down from heaven and joined a body. So the mind was separate. And his student Aristotle also maintained an idea of a soul that had its own will, but believed that all knowledge in the mind first came through the senses. And we're going to talk about that again when we get to empiricism, when we talk about the nature of science. So Aristotle put more emphasis on the role of the body in the development of mind, and he also influenced John Locke's blank slate idea of the mind as well. Now, going back to the dualistic mind, because of this idea that the mind is some kind of spirit, it leaves us open to the idea that evil spirits could also take over the body. And so it appears that early Christians treated the mentally ill as if they were possessed by evil spirits. And here's a painting of early Christians trying to cast out evil spirits. In the Middle Ages, they were considered demon-possessed. And in the Renaissance, this contributed to the idea that they were witches. Now, Christians have practiced exorcism for centuries. And exorcism is basically a ritual that is designed to remove demons or evil spirits from people. According to the Bible, Jesus Christ cast out demons, which is known as exorcism. Unfortunately, because some of these people appeared to be... here's a picture of Jesus casting out a demon or evil spirit from somebody. Unfortunately, because some of these people appeared to be mentally ill or having seizures, this has had an unintended consequence of stigmatizing people with mental illness as being demon-possessed. However, spiritual causes were actually not the only explanation given for illnesses that Jesus healed. In fact, in Matthew 4:24, it's evident that not all people who came to him for healing were considered to be demon-possessed, but some were considered being moonstruck. That's the word that was translated lunatic in Greek. This could refer to either epilepsy or madness, as both were thought to be caused by the cycles of the moon in astrology. So again, that's because we see that this word that was used there was lunatic, which literally meant moonstruck. So that was another explanation given besides people being demon possessed. I think it's important to know that not all people who came to Jesus for healing were because they were possessed by evil spirits. Demon possession was not the only explanation. Now I want to be careful. While I would not want to rule out or deny that spiritual issues may be the cause for some people's behavior, it's also important to understand that spiritual causes are not the only explanations given. In addition, the Bible rarely details exactly how or why these healings occurred, except that they appear to be miracles. And the writers could be hardly expected to understand things according to modern science either. So let's fast forward to medieval times, and we're going to look at medieval scholastics. Some of the earliest contributors to our understanding of psychology today were actually theologians, people who studied religious teachings. And they try to understand how the mind and body were connected. Here's a painting of someone who portrayed the mind or the person as separate from the body. These theologians believed in dualism, that the human soul was distinct from the body but resided in harmony or unity with the body. So medieval scholastics were centered around cathedral schools, which are the basis of modern universities. So modern universities, like where I teach as a professor, actually originated in Europe during the medieval era of about 1100 to 1700 AD. And they were, and so here's a picture of me in my doctoral professorial gown that I sometimes wear for university ceremonies. As you can see, it looks somewhat similar to, or it looks like it has a medieval feel to it. So universities, or these cathedral schools, were run by the church cathedrals and monastic schools and were primarily responsible for teaching theology originally. But they had a large influence on philosophy and sciences as well. Here's a painting of a university lecture taking place in the medieval times. During the medieval era, scholasticism was used to teach critical thinking during a time when people increasingly questioned the Christian church's dogma. It was essentially a teaching method that emphasized dialectical reasoning by attempting to resolve contradictions between opposing points. The most famous medieval scholastic was the theologian St. Thomas Aquinas, who lived from 1225 to 1274 AD, and he taught that humans had a distinct soul and body that were united. Aquinas is credited for reviving an interest in the works of the ancient philosopher Aristotle. If you recall, we just talked about him a couple minutes ago. Just as Aristotle believed in a will, Aquinas also believed that the soul had its will that controlled the body. Borrowing from Aristotle, Aquinas believed that the soul had three main faculties: the rational faculty, the sensitive faculty, and the nutritive faculty. The rational faculty was responsible for the intellect and the will. The sensitive faculty was responsible for the senses, that's why it's called sensitive faculty. And the nutritive faculty was responsible for taking care of needs for food, growth, and reproduction. That's why it was called the nutritive faculty. So medieval scholasticism contributes to this idea of a dualistic mind-body connection. René Descartes, who lived between 1629 and 1649, was a French philosopher and scientist who also maintained a mind-body distinction, which has come to be known as Cartesian dualism, named after him. He is famous for saying, "I think, therefore I am." Descartes believed that humans had animal spirits that controlled the body, and these were fluids that roamed around the body. This was, now you have to understand, this was prior to the understanding of electrical signals in the nervous system. And so that's why he believed that there must be some kind of fluid associated with animal spirits. And because of his emphasis on dualism, he believed that the human mind had complete free will. In other words, the mind operated independently, just happened to control the body through these spirits. And that takes us to faculty psychology. Building on Aquinas' concept of faculties, Thomas Reid, who lived in the 1700s, was a Scottish philosopher, coined the term faculty psychology. This approach attempted to understand how the mind connected with the body and saw the mind as a collection of separate modules or faculties assigned to various tasks. He hypothesized that there were 27 faculties of the mind, most of which were thought to be innate. While this is outdated, of course, we know that the brain does have parts to it. That takes us to phrenology, which is really built on faculty psychology. Faculty psychology is really interesting. Phrenology is really interesting. It's probably the one thing, if anybody thinks of quackery, it's probably this. If you ever see a sculpture or a bust of a white head with lines all over the scalp, this is from the quackery of the past, the phrenology or pseudoscience. Franz Joseph Gall, who also lived in the later 1700s and early 1800s, expanded on faculty psychology by trying to connect it to the biology of the brain. And he made an important emphasis that the mind was located in the brain. However, he also believed that parts of the brain had certain innate faculties and that the size and shape of that area of the brain reflected its abilities. Thus, he believed that examining someone's skull can determine the individual's personality and abilities. Now, phrenology is a pseudoscience, or quackery, as some people might call it. The idea that the bumps on your head determine your abilities is pretty much discredited. Another popular pseudoscience that still is popular today is vitalism. Now, if we go this has a long history. If we go way back to Hippocrates' idea of humors, there's always been a long history of believing that illnesses and human behavior are a result of the balance or imbalance in vital life forces. Vitalism posits that some spark or esoteric energy is what differentiates living organisms from non-living objects. And a popular personality in this movement was Franz Anton Mesmer, who lived again in the 1700s. Was a German doctor who theorized that natural energy was transferred between all objects in what he called animal magnetism, because it applied specifically to living, breathing creatures. So again, still don't know much about electrical forces, but he called it animal magnetism because not so much about animals, but because all living, breathing creatures are essentially animals. And this was later referred to as mesmerism. And while it was a forerunner of hypnosis, mesmerism was debunked as a fraud, and that it seemed that people were influenced more by their imagination or a placebo effect. However, it's pretty popular, as back in that day, he had up to 3,000 people came to see him per day at one point. So it had a very big influence, and it was influencing the development of hypnosis, and these ideas are still felt today. Vitalism is similar in many respects to Eastern medical traditions that are still popular, involving Buddhist or Hindu beliefs from India and China that believe in a natural energy flow. In Chinese, it is referred to as qi, and it's increasingly popular among New Age proponents or practitioners of Tantra, Reiki, or energy therapies. And this is a diagram of 7 chakras that comes from Hinduism and Tantra. Basically, the idea that there's centers of energy in the body. Now, if you ever heard people say, I'm going to send positive thoughts or energy your way, they're practicing similar principles. And that brings us to the law of attraction. The law of attraction teaches that thoughts are made from energy and that like attracts like, whether it is positive or negative energy. Proponents of the law believe that positive thinking, combined with some creative visualization that something has already happened, will have the power to make something happen. This has found its way even into Christianity through the writings of Norman Vincent Peale's The Power of Positive Thinking, and through televangelists who promote a prosperity gospel. Let's summarize so far. If we were to look at this from an overarching picture, we might contrast fake science with false science. Is there a difference between fake science and false science? I would like to say there is. Well, first of all, why would anyone teach things that are not scientific or true? Well, a legitimate reason may simply be that many people had honest intentions to establish a scientific theory that was ultimately disproven, as in the case of some of the theories described here. Some scientific theories were made in good faith and in an attempt to explain observations, but were incorrect and discarded with the passing of time. According to Thomas Kuhn's book, he wrote a book called The Structure of Scientific Revelations, science progresses through different revolutions in which old paradigms are thought patterns or theories, in which these old paradigms were discarded in favor of new ones. And we look at these outdated ideas in retrospect. As they say, hindsight is always 20/20. However, and here's a diagram that he would use to illustrate how science has changed. So we have the paradigm, but eventually data that we try to fit in that paradigm doesn't fit. So eventually we have a crisis in which we have to just develop a new paradigm, a new model, which then changes the paradigm. But then those paradigms eventually become old as new data comes along that challenges that paradigm. So for example, we used to believe that the Earth was the center of the universe. But then people discovered that's not true. They suggested that the sun is the center of the universe. Okay, so that became the new model. But now we know that no, the sun is not the center of the universe. The sun is just like any other star in the universe. And so that's now what we understand. So we go through phases in which paradigms are replaced. That doesn't necessarily mean, though, that the earlier theories were fake. It just meant that they weren't correct or they were inaccurate. However, other theories were never based on any real evidence to begin with. They are what we might call fake science or pseudoscience, not just merely a false science or incorrect science. Astrology, phrenology, mesmerism, and vitalism have been debunked scientifically and are considered pseudoscience, meaning something that sounds scientific, sounds sciencey, they use flowery scientifically language, but it's not based on empirical evidence using the scientific method, as it's not falsifiable. So for example, some people would, let's look at it. Why do people engage in pseudoscience? Some people have a naive realism that what they see or perceive is the truth. Like they might say, well, hey, let's say they go outside and every time they step outside, it rains on them. So they start to think, well, maybe there's something going on here. That's because as human beings, we seek out patterns to make sense of our world. And for example, we might perceive a correlation between two things that may not actually be related. Like many people go to a doctor, they might share all the symptoms that they have thinking they're all related. And the doctor may say, no, just because you have those two symptoms at the same time doesn't mean they're actually related. But that's the way we approach our world. And sometimes people construct theories. They're really interesting, but they're not based on actual evidence, and there's no correlation between the things. But then there are some who have agendas or ulterior motives to use fake science to gain influence over people for their own selfish purposes, such as for money or sex or to advance a cause. They have an agenda. But if they were genuinely interested in what actually benefits others, then they would be more interested in the evidence for what actually works, not what supports their theory. So you might think of some examples, like would you want to know someone is promoting their supplements that they came up with, or would you want to know that they care more about if it actually works or not. And the same thing applies to psychology. There's lots of different interventions and things that people have come up with, and maybe they might try and use science to prove something, but we really want to know, does it work? Is it going to benefit people? In A Skeptic's Handbook, Kurtz writes 3 primary criteria for pseudoscience. In these, systematic or structured experimental methods were not used to develop them. Also, the theory is not really testable or falsifiable, meaning it can't be proven wrong. Like, for example, even if you had data that said it was wrong, you would always have some someone would always come up with some fancy explanation for why it still works. Like, for example, they might say, well, you just aren't looking at it right, or something like that. And lastly, what makes it fake is when the proponent claims that the theory is confirmed, even though there was no real systematic investigation. Now, Scott Lilienfeld also points out that pseudoscience tends to not change over time. For example, astrology is pretty much the same as it's always been for thousands of years, whereas science is constantly changing. If you are rigidly holding on to a theory and it's not open to change, then you have to question what's the motivation, because genuine science is open to revision, it's open to change. Also, pseudoscience avoids critical peer review because they're not open to change. They're open to maintaining their beliefs. They have an agenda. It also emphasizes confirming what's already believed rather than seeking critical evaluation, like I said. And so they have confirmation bias. They might use selective data to prove their theory, but they're going to dismiss data that doesn't prove it. Also, they generally rely on anecdotal evidence, and they dismiss contradictory data with long explanations. Now, I just want to pause here for a second and say, I know some people, and the other problem with this is that many times people call something pseudoscience simply because they don't like it. And so the word pseudoscience gets thrown around a lot. That's why it's important to have criteria to establish, well, what really is a pseudoscience? A lot of times people say just about anything they disagree with is pseudoscience, but that doesn't necessarily make it pseudoscience. We might have different angles. We might look at things differently, but it can still be scientific. Another thing I want to caution us to say is, religion. I believe in. I'm a fan of religion, as I have a religious practice, and the vast majority of humans do. Is religion a pseudoscience? Well, no, not necessarily, unless it's claiming something that it's not. If a religion claims to have a scientific explanation, then it can become a pseudoscience. But it's not really pseudoscience unless it's claiming to have a scientific explanation for something. Once it does, then it is becoming a pseudoscience. Pseudoscience is what claims to be a science. It tries to act like a science and it sounds like a science. But religion oftentimes doesn't appeal to the authority of science. It appeals to the authority of faith. And that's different, and there's a different source of truth. But some people can hold scientific beliefs and religious beliefs and not necessarily have them contradict. What's problematic is when you use a religion to impose on science, and then that becomes dangerous, because then you can we want to be open to what is scientifically true without necessarily imposing agendas on it either. So let's look at the last section of under this section of pseudosciences and spiritualistic psychology. Pseudoscience has unfortunately oftentimes been used to support scientific racism. Colonialism and slavery have integrated racist myths into European culture. For example, by the end of the 19th century, it was accepted by many psychiatrists that members of the African race had smaller brains as well as a more natural instinct for labor and were psychologically inferior compared to members of the European race. Dr. Benjamin Rush was the father of American psychiatry. He lived in the later half of the 1700s. He advocated against slavery and joined the abolition movement. Sounds like a really nice guy. Great, right? Well, except for he also bought a slave and argued that African Americans suffered from negritude, a mild form of leprosy that might be treatable. He actually suggested that. Another physician, Dr. Samuel Cartwright, used the term drapetomania for the supposed mental illness that caused slaves to flee captivity. And African Americans, angry about their oppression, were sometimes labeled schizophrenic due to their supposed pathological reaction of emotional disharmony, hostility, and aggression. But if you were oppressed, wouldn't you feel the same way too? Here's a picture of Gordon, who had suffered from so many lashes that this picture was used to advocate for the abolition of slavery. Now, scientific racism can be seen in the eugenics movement. Now, the eugenics movement probably had an innocuous start. Many scientists in the beginning actually supported it. And it sounded pretty scientific. The reason why was they wanted to improve the human population's genetics. Sounds like a good intention, right? By controlled breeding to increase the occurrences of desirable heritable characteristics. The problem, though, is how do you determine what is desirable and what is superior? And that's the main problem. Maybe the people going into it didn't realize right away what they were doing, but it had major implications for society, and it was very harmful. This tended to promote white Europeans as genetically superior, while attempting to exclude races they deemed inferior. In fact, forced sterilizations were legalized based on eugenics principles. And the Nazis in Germany took this a step further during the Holocaust when they tried to promote Aryanism while committing genocide of Jews in German-occupied Europe. They murdered around 6 million Jews, about 2/3 of the Jewish population in Europe, and others they considered inferior. And Nazis developed a pseudoscientific system of facial measurement and other methods that supposedly determined racial descent. Now, unfortunately, eugenics still casts a shadow over the field, in the mental health fields. For example, the terms imbecile, moron, idiot, these are derogatory terms that we use these as slang today to insult people, but they were used to classify people with different intellectual abilities. Psychologists and psychiatrists used these terms initially to classify people with different intellectual abilities. Now, today, we don't use them, thankfully, but still, there's these ideas that some people are more superior than others based on their abilities. And despite eugenics falling out of favor, scientific racism still persists. In 1994, Herrnstein and Murray published a book, The Bell Curve, to prove that there were hereditary differences between race groups. And they claimed that this was meant to simply be honest rather than bowing to the pressures of political correctness. And they were simply trying to say, hey, we're trying to help people. If people aren't, good at math or they don't have a good IQ, we don't want to overly penalize them. The problem, though, is that it has been used, unfortunately, to suggest that some people are inferior to others. So in the book Superior, The Return of Race Science by Angelina Saini, in 2019, just recently, she argues that many scientists still research racial differences, trying to find that one race is more intelligent or superior than another, despite the fact that pretty much everybody in the scientific fields recognize that race is more of a social construct rather than a biological reality. And we're going to talk about that more in the future, just so you know. Now, the last thing I want to talk about that's somewhat related to scientific racism is evolutionary psychology. And evolutionary psychology has more credibility. The problem is that arguments stemming from evolutionary psychology, which says that our abilities and behaviors are results of natural selection, have often been used to support scientific racism and sexism. For example, I know of one particular psychologist who goes around in the media and he cites evolutionary psychology, but people have accused him of being racist and sexist, primarily because he uses these arguments to say, well, this is the way people have evolved. But one person once argued that in evolutionary psychology, rats and people are always the same, but men and women are different. Well, you have to wonder, what is the agenda here? The field of evolutionary psychology has sometimes been accused of being a pseudoscience because of its lack of falsifiability. It's hard to have the same rigor and the same scientific methodology to prove something when it's hard to know because you can't go back in time. That's not to say that it's not true. I'm just wanting to say that unfortunately has oftentimes been used with the wrong intentions. So in closing, while religious faith is important to many people, the dualistic belief in a mind-body distinction with the soul in charge of the mind has caused problems in impeding scientific progress. In addition, the belief in an energy force that influences behavior continues to be popular despite much empirical evidence. So there is a lot of woo-woo out there. And why do people believe in pseudosciences? Well, perhaps because there's some truth in them. But that's why the truth is more that if we change our thinking, we might see positive results, like with the law of attraction. But the problem is that it's not so much about some energy that we produce. It's more because we changed our mindset that resulted in better outcomes. And that's why it's so important to understand psychology and its effects on our success in life and our relationships is important. When we change our mindsets, people do perceive us better, and we maintain the focus and motivation to succeed in accomplishing our goals. There seems to be an assumption that if people made a mistake, that somehow they weren't strong enough, or they didn't pray hard enough, or if they need help, that they didn't have enough moral courage, or they didn't have enough faith. And that's not the right attitude. We need to get away from this assumption that mental health problems or psychology are all due to moral failings or spirituality. And sometimes it's just biology. And so that's the point I hope that we can learn from this lesson today. So I want to end this lesson looking at spiritual perspectives. Sometimes positive thinking is not enough. When I was younger, when I was in college, I would beat myself up because whenever I didn't do things correctly. And therefore, it would be no surprise that I was not initially successful in school. In fact, I virtually expected myself to fail, and so I did, which reinforced the belief that I shouldn't bother to try. I would just call myself a realist, as I had a skeptical approach to life. Well, one of the controversial books that made a difference in my life was a book on positive thinking by Norman Vincent Peale. In fact, it was called The Positive Power of Jesus Christ. And Peale encouraged me to think positively rather than negatively about what God could do in my life. And after all, some of these principles are taught by Jesus himself. Jesus says, whatever you ask in prayer, believe that you have received it and it will be yours. He said that in Mark 11:24. And he also described having a faith that can move mountains. So these principles had a tremendous influence on my life, helped me a lot. And anytime I was afraid I would not pass a test, I just prayed and trusted God that God would take care of it, and I saw miracles happen. I changed from being a failing student to being an honors student and then getting a PhD. So I think there's something to be said about that. Until the miracles stop. Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians 13:11, he says, when I was a child, I talked like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I put away the ways of childhood behind me. Don't get me wrong, miracles still happen, but they also do not sometimes. I remember praying that God would spare the life of my father and some close friends, and they still died. I felt like the disciples asking Jesus, why wasn't our faith strong enough? Perhaps if I had only believed harder. So what's the danger of the prosperity gospel and the law of attraction? Unfortunately, teaching of the law of attraction has also been abused by faith healers and popular televangelists to promote a prosperity gospel. The prosperity gospel teaches that God will bless us if we have faith in him. But if we face hard times, then it's because we did not pray hard enough. And these wealthy preachers teach that if we just send them more money in faith, God will bless us with even more money in return. Unfortunately, this has led people to give all their money hoping that they would get in return, but instead going broke and not being able to cover their medical expenses. The danger with faith healers is that people may not get the real medical help that actually works. And this is what Ellen White in her writings wrote about. She says, the apostles of nearly all forms of Spiritism claim to have power to heal. They attribute this power to electricity, magnetism, and the so-called sympathetic remedies, or to latent forces within the mind of man. And there are not a few, even in this Christian age, who go to these healers instead of trusting in the power of the living God and the skill of well-qualified physicians. The mother, watching by the sickbed of her child, exclaims, I can do no more. Is there no physician who has the power to restore my child? She is told of the wonderful cures performed by some clairvoyant or magnetic healer, and she trusts her dear one to his charge, placing it as verily in the hand of Satan as if he were standing by her side. I just want to pause here for a second and just say, we're not saying that people who believe these things are evil or that they are satanic, but that they can be misused, because wouldn't you want somebody who is suffering to go to something and go to people who will actually be effective, and that there's empirical science that proves that it works? Unfortunately, when we put our hands in the things that are not proven, we're not, you're basically leaving your outcomes to chance. The same thing applies to dating relationships. I know people who study pickup artists and their methods of seduction, even though the reality is that their methods are not proven by science. But why would they pay thousands of dollars for these things? They're looking for that kind of hope, this magical cure, when the reality is that there are things that you can do out there that are based on science. And that's where science comes in. We're not saying that, again, we're not saying that religion is evil but the difference here is that religion doesn't claim to supersede science necessarily, or shouldn't. And when it does, then it's in danger. What is the danger of thinking we have innate powers? And if Satan or the devil ever had a plan to lead us away from God, it would be through the use of pseudosciences that teach people that they have special innate powers or that they are like gods. But this idea will only destroy us in the process. Again, Ellen White warns that in many cases, the imagination is captivated by scientific research, and men are flattered to the consciousness of their own powers. The sciences which treat of the human mind are very much exalted, and they're good in their place. So thankfully, she's not against psychology. She's just simply saying they are good in their place, but they are seized upon by Satan as his powerful agents to deceive and destroy souls. His arts are accepted as from heaven, and he thus receives the worship which suits him well. The world, which is supposed to be benefited so much by phrenology and animal magnetism, never was so corrupt as now. And she wrote this at a time when those things were very popular. And she continues, through these sciences, we could put that in quotes, so-called sciences, virtue is destroyed and the foundations of spiritualism are laid. There's a danger that we may think that the laws of nature will bend to us because somehow we are special to the universe. This is known as a personal fable. Unfortunately, young people will abuse their bodies and take risks driving under the influence because they believe that if they just think positive, happy thoughts, they will be immune to the laws of nature and its consequences. These people view God as a positive energy or a force to be manipulated, and not as someone to have a personal relationship with. God is not some magical genie or a vending machine that if we just put in a prayer and send some money or whatever, we will get a desired outcome. Instead, God works through the laws of nature and science. I still see miracles happen, but they're not because we worked magic, but rather because we maintain hope and move forward with positive expectations and trusted that the best outcomes might occur, which results in what looks like miracles. And maybe we could call them miracles. Is there a danger in always getting what we want? Yes, sometimes there is a danger that if we always got what we hope for, then life merely becomes about fulfilling our egocentric pursuit of narcissistic desires. You know, I enjoy this comedian. Some people think he's really tacky, but I like him. He's this JP Sears, and he has some videos online. He likes to poke fun of hipsters and yoga trends. You know, in one of his more profound, honest videos that he did about the law of attraction delusion, he's called it, he says this, and I want to share this. He says, "So what can we do about all this? One option is to use the control drum of the law of attraction so that we can find comfort in believing that we can have anything we want, and we can become more than what we think we are, and we can become more than other people. We can use this belief to discharge the anxiety of becoming ourselves. Or we can maybe dip our toes into the waters of surrender rather than trying to create more control, rather than trying to let our egos dictate how our life should unfold so that we don't have to feel the fear of the mystery of the serendipity of our life. As we dip our toes into the surrender of the Spirit's view, we release control. We become curious about what it is to be in our life, and we become curious about how we can find what it is we think we're missing." You know, just to end on that note, positive thinking has its limits. We do not always get what we want in life, and sometimes we face hard times anyway. Therefore, I've learned to try to pray not so much to change God's mind to get what I want, but more to change myself to help me accept what God has in store for me and to help me to have the courage to keep moving forward.